My name is Mike Lindner. I'm the president of the Historical Society, and we're very pleased to have our newest board member, Dan Biggins, provide this special presentation today. We ask that if you have questions, you please hold them to the end or to that. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So welcome and thank you for coming. This is a really important story. I don't know how many people know about the Carlisle Indian School, but it was the first flagship boarding school off reservation for the Native Americans. So these photos you're seeing here on the slides here are all Apaches that came from San Carlos, and a lot of them from around here when they had the Verde Reservation. These are all available through the Dickinson College. They did a really good job of archiving photos, records, student ID cards. So the San Carlos Apache and Yavapai Indians left for Carlisle in 1884. And so this story is about their journey, their time at Carlisle, and then the return to the Verde Valley. So like I said, the Carlisle Indian School was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's about 120 miles west of Philadelphia in the Cumberland Valley. It was founded in 1879 under Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt. He had been in the Civil War, and he also had managed Native Americans at a prison in St. Petersburg, Florida, where they sent a lot of the troublesome Native Americans at the time. And Geronimo ended up there at one point as well. Over its 39 years, it had over 8,000 students come through there. The Carlisle was basically old barracks for the Army of the Northern Republic, and it was transferred to into the War Department, Interior War Department, and then after World War I, the school was closed. It had a lot of other issues that led to its closing. I don't have time to get into that day, but there was a lot of corruption, there was some abuse of the children, the students, a lot of other things. So we'll go from there. So this is just a picture of Carlisle and the grounds, and this is in 1912. You can see there's a lot of students there. It was a very militaristic run. That's how Pratt ran it, kind of like military school that would, people sent their children to. The boys had ranks. They wore uniforms with the ranks. So the whole process was treated militaristically. So this is a letter to the War Department informing them about the sending of the 52 San Carlos Apache and Yavapai Indians to Carlisle. So I have the honor to transmit herewith for your information a copy of the telegram dated 24th from Commanding General of the Army of the Pacific. 52 children for Carlisle, 47 boys and 5 girls. Among the former are sons of Loco and Benito. So Loco was a chief of the Membranos, and Benito was the Chiricahua Apache chief. I'm not sure about Carlisle. It said also a brother Carlisle. What's interesting about this document is, if you read it, it says, your obedient servant, Robert Todd Lincoln. That's Abraham Lincoln's only surviving son, who ended up becoming Secretary of War. So like I said, Carlisle is located about 120 miles west of Philadelphia in the Cumberland Valley. The journey to San Carlos was about 2,100 miles. So they left on January 23rd, 1884, arrived on February 2nd, 1884, 11 days. So it was a pretty long journey. First they took a wagon to the railroad. I'm not sure exactly where, but it was either down to Tucson, up through New Mexico, or they may have gone north and up near probably Winslow or Flag, wherever the railroad was. But it probably was south of Tucson since they were at San Carlos, which is near Globe. So this would be the first time they'd ever been on a train. So you can imagine for these children, some as young as 3 and 4 years old up to 17 or 18, what that trip was like, seeing large amounts of the United States homes and then eventually tall buildings and just vast amounts of people. They had never seen anything like that here. The time they were here, Arizona was just being settled. So this is a picture of the 52 as they arrived in 1884. And if you look at it, I counted up, there's more than 52 there. So either they gathered a few more on the way in New Mexico or not. But you can see they look pretty, like the trip was pretty rugged. So this is them after 4 months. Obviously, they've cleaned them up, got their uniforms. And on this one, there's not 52, there's less than 52. So either, for some reason, some may have been sick in an infirmary or not. So not really sure, but this is most of the 52. So through the student records, which they, like I said, they kept detailed records at Carlisle, it's very well documented. So as I went through all the 52 students, 90% of them, they identified on their student ID cards as their parents were dead. So we don't know if that was from, some of them came from the exodus from here to San Carlos and lost their parents, or if their parents died while they were at San Carlos. So, and then the breakout by their band, by the different kind of tribe they're with, we had 29 Tonto, which are Apache or Dutse, San Carlos, 11, Chiricahua, 4, Warm Springs, which are Apaches out of New Mexico, there was 2. They did move a lot of Warm Springs Apaches from New Mexico to San Carlos for a while. They would try to consolidate them all at San Carlos. Had 4 Tonto Mojave. Those were basically half Apache and half Yavapai. So in the Verde Valley, you had Yavapai on the west side of the river, basically the Verde River, and Apache on the east side. But there was a mix of clans and families in the Verde Valley around the river that intermixed and married. And that became a different clan of these Tonto Mojaves, or basically Yavapai Apache mix. And then there's one White Mountain. So unfortunately, 12 of the 52 died while they were at Carlos. So most of these from diseases they'd never been exposed before. If you think about it, they lived out here and weren't exposed to the diseases in a large populations like we're back east. Most notably at the time was tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it. So on the left, we have Ada Foxcatcher. She died July 13th, 1888 of consumption. In the middle, there's a list of the 12 that died. And then you see on the right, Lorenzo Bonito, who was the son of the chief Bonito, who voluntarily sent his son there. I'm sure they said to help support the other Native Americans and sending their children there as well. They really wanted to encourage that. But unfortunately, they didn't say exactly what he died from. They just said he had suffered from a severe illness for over a year. So you can assume it was probably tuberculosis or some, who knows what else. But he was only about 13 years old. So the outing system, so while at Carlisle, they had a system where they would teach him schooling, reading, writing, English, but they had what they call this outing system. What it was they would send him out to farms and homes and other areas to immerse in the white culture, and a lot of more farms. So around Carlisle, there was only so many farms and homes they could send them to. And after a while, they needed to spread out and send them to other areas around New England. And basically, some of them went as far as Massachusetts. But Miss Ely here, who worked at Carlisle, was from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia. And she was born and raised there, and she went with General Pratt and met the Quakers at their meeting house and took several of the Apache Indian boys there and asked them, would you take these boys on, let them live in your homes, let them help you work on your farms, go to school. They even let them go to school in the public schools or if they were educated enough and could do it. And they did. So one of the interesting things about this story is I was born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, right in this farming area. And my parents, when I was 6 years old, had bought an old farmhouse. And I know who the owner was, and I thought through this research I would find one of these children that was at that farm, but I never did. But it was just kind of interesting. So I have a little bit of a connection to that. So this is a picture of what they would show of the boys in the outing system. You can see them farming, doing other chores. They would train them in carpentry and other things. But mainly farming, because they wanted them to go back, either learn farming, go back to Arizona and start farm and settle down on land instead of being nomadic, which all the Apache and Mojave, or Apache and Yavapai Indians were all nomadic. They didn't really live in one place in Arizona. They went wherever the food was at the time, whether it was south in the winter or north in the summer. But all the girls learned, like home ec, they learned how to cook. They learned how to clean, ironing. So a lot of the girls had actually gone to some resorts and other areas up in New England and did like maid keeping, housekeeping, or they would just live in homes with the people and get themselves immersed. So this is a group of Apaches that, while at Carlisle, and I just want to read it. I know you can't see that, but I wanted to read what it says. Bear with me. So this says, of all the Indians Carlisle has undertaken, no tribe presented a more hopeless outlook than the Apache from Arizona, who've long held a most unenviable reputation as the outlaws and Ishmaelites of the Indians. What a saying, right? Carlisle's experience with Apache is that they are as susceptible as others to civilization. I think what they meant by this was they were susceptible to alcoholism and some other things that a lot of people at that time struggled with. But they made the remark that they are unusually active and are valuable as workers, which they did use them a lot. They were really exploited, to be honest. So what they would do is they set up contracts with these families, and the families would pay Carlisle school a certain amount of money for a certain amount of time. All that money was supposedly in the student's bank account back at Carlisle, but they didn't have access to the bank account unless they asked for the money. And then, of course, they were supposed to be given money while they're at the home of whoever they're staying with in order to get clothing and shoes and other things. So they had to rely on them to get whatever money they earned. But they did provide them food and housing, and there's very many of them did very well at some of these homes, but some of them were not treated as well. So it just depended on the family, how well they were treated and how well they did. So after 1900, well, they all returned around 1894. So they tried to keep them. They were contracted for 5 years. They were only supposed to stay 5 years, but most of them stayed around 9 years. And Pratt had been talking to the government to say, look, we need to keep them longer and keep them immersed here and not return them to San Carlos. One reason was San Carlos, the government was not doing a very good job of providing food and supplies, and a lot of them were still starving there. If you listen to Vincent Randall, the Apache elder, he would talk about how this was basically a concentration camp, and it was. It was very mismanaged. The government didn't really provide the funding they needed. It was really not very well run. But anyway, they returned back to San Carlos in 1894. A lot of them had anywhere from a third grade to second grade education. Around 1900, the reservation just kind of died. They'd captured Geronimo, all the struggles with the breakouts from the ones that were warriors had settled down, and they just migrated, all the Yavapai and Apache just migrated back to their homelands all over Arizona. But there were many who returned to the Verde Valley. But when they got here, they found that their homes and areas they used to live in near the Verde River were taken over by the white settlers, and they had to struggle to find areas where they could live. But they settled in Beaver Creek, around Camp Verde, what is now Clarkdale, around Cottonwood, wherever they could find a place to live. And then some started farming and others started doing work, whether it was for gathering firewood, doing housework for some of the white settlers, and then in Jerome, a lot of them worked up in Jerome doing different labor. So this is a student ID card for Gilbert Pusher. Unfortunately, he's the only one I don't have a picture for, but there's a lot of information here. So in the upper part, you see you have Gilbert's name. He's at the San Carlos Agency. He's an Apache. But they called all the Native Americans Apache at the time, even if they were Yavapai. It was just at the time they just assumed they were all Apache, but they were not. But he was definitely a Tonto Apache. They have a given name. He was called the Pusher. Through my research, some of these given names I don't believe were really the real names. Some you could tell by the names. They were probably true Native American names, but a lot of them were not. And then the home address is either a relative or sometimes a chief. But you can see that both of his parents are listed as dead. Then the blood, they have half. And I found this not to be true all the time. I'm not sure why they did this, but it turned out as I looked at the records that he was actually a full-blood Tonto Apache. So there was some reasoning behind that. I don't want to go into details. I'm not sure that I know the real reason. But anyway, he was there in 1884, supposed to be there 5 years, and he left 1893. But what's interesting is, so this two country part in the bottom lists all the homes, the names of the people, the town, and where they were farming, or living with these people, either farming and staying the whole time they were there. So there's a lot of information about who they were with. And then the bottom part is a report after leaving Carlisle. So what happened around 1910, they started sending out surveys to all the students who had left and gone back to the reservation. They wanted to know how they were doing. And we'll get into some of those responses later. But what this record is saying they had heard from him in 1910 when he was at San Carlos, in 1911 when he was in Camp Verde. So this is Gilbert Pusher's 1910 census of where he was living in Beaver Creek. And what's really nice about this census, it was unique to the Native American. It was a separate census, and so down in the bottom, you had questions that they would ask them, and it would tell them what tribe they were from, did you go to school? And you can see it says he went to Carlisle Indian School, what they were living in, and it says here he was living in Aboriginal, which means he was in a wickiup. They called it sometimes a teepee, but it was really wickiup. So he's 45 at this time. He's in a second marriage. I don't have any records prior. He's been married for 10 years and he speaks English, obviously. His wife is age 28. Is she able to speak English? No, she only speaks Tonto. But she's a basket maker, and that was very common for the Native American women to make baskets to make money on the side. And then they have two children, a daughter age 12. She doesn't speak English and doesn't go to school, and then another daughter age 9, which also, no, they don't speak English, but they speak Tonto. But they're not going to school. But at the time, there was no school, and they wouldn't let them go to the white school. So this is that record I was telling you about where they sent their survey out, and Gilbert Pusher responds back. It's ask him, are you married? And he says, yes, to a Tonto Apache. Nas Dazai goes, what's your address? He says, Camp Verde, Arizona. What is your present occupation? Unskilled laborer. Tell me something of your present home. And he says, native teepee located in village of Tonto Apache tribe on Beaver Creek, 10 miles from Camp Verde. And up here it says, what property in way of land, stock, buildings, or money do you have? 5 head of Indian pony. Have you ever been in the Indian service? He says, no. That would be, were you ever a scout? And he said, no. What other positions have you held since Carly? He says, none. And it says, tell us something interesting about your life. He goes, I earn a living for myself and my wife and our 3 children by working for wages which range from $1.50 to $2, and I believe that's a day. I have never been in trouble, and I try to keep the law and advise my people the same way. So now this is a birth certificate of 1925 for Gilbert Pusher's son. What's nice about birth certificates is they give you a lot of information about the parents as well. As you see, his son has no name. It was very common that they didn't name their children until after so many years. Each tribe had a different way of determining when that was, but a lot of the censuses, they would just call it baby. That's all they would say, it didn't have a name. But you can see Gilbert on this birth certificate, it says he's 4/4 Indian, meaning he's full-blood Apache, and same with his wife. He says he was residence is Middle Verde, and she's from Middle Verde, because I think at this time they moved down to the Middle Verde area and were either living or working. But he was tied back to Beaver Creek. But he says his birthplace is Fossil Creek, which makes sense for the Tonto Apache. And then now she was born in San Carlos, so it says he's a farmer on a government farm, and she's a housewife. I did learn that around 1910 or 11. The government did subsidize farming, trying to get more of the Native Americans to do farming. A lot of them didn't do farming. The men were never into farming. That was always the woman's job. And so they thought that job was really below a lot of them. Now, of course, Gilbert had learned to farm back when he was back at Carlisle, so a lot of them did do that. A lot more of them got into raising horses. But typically, farming was not the man's job. So this is a 1930 census for Camp Verde. He's now 69 and he's a widower, so his wife has passed away. And he's still doing farming, and he has with him his son, his 4 sons, Jasper, Arthur, Oscar, and Brett. They're also farming with it. And then next door, on the next line, you see there's another house with on the system, and that's his other son who's married. So now we're in 1950, and Gilbert's now 91 years old. He's had a long life. He's living with his granddaughter, Betsy Pusher Jackson, lodging with a Rosalind E. Russell. There are some Jacksons, and there's definitely a lot of Russells in Clarkdale. And then living right next door is Bill Jackson and wife Maisie Pusher Jackson, which is Gilbert's daughter, listed with her children. And then there's a Pridey Pusher also living by there. So this is Gilbert's death certificate. He was 90 years old, 6 months and 14 days. It says cause of death, senility, no doctor. He basically just died of old age. But that's a long life for someone, especially during that time. Place of death, McGuireville, which makes sense because he lived near Beaver Creek, he said. Informant was Arthur Pusher, his son, who lived in Rimrock. And he's actually buried in the Middle Verde Yavapai Apache Cemetery. So this is a picture of his grave at the cemetery. And you can see it lists all of his children, Oscar, Arthur, Pratty, and then his daughter, Maisie Jackson. And so through these grave sites, here we have Maisie, his daughter Maisie, and we get more information. She died in 1994, and her father's Gilbert, and then that's her children. You can see Betsy Carol Randall, or Pusher Randall. And then this is Betsy Carol Jackson Randall's. She died in 2007, not that long ago. Do we have anybody? We don't have anybody here from the Yavapai Apache Nation, do we? It's too bad, because I'm sure they're familiar with a lot of these names. Hopefully they'll get to see the video and the information will be useful to them. So this is our next student, Amelia Alcide. She is also, it says Tonto Mojave. I think she's half Apache and half Yavapai. Her parents were both living, so they willingly sent her along. She had got a third grade education, but she only stayed the minimum 5 years. She left when her time was expired, and she had done housekeeping. She was in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, and one of the records I saw was she was living in that town of Hepburn where I was born, and she was actually baptized in an Episcopal church there. So we know she had lived with this couple in Willow Grove for over 2 years. Probably can't see it, but from 87 to 89, she stayed at that family's home the whole time. In 1890, she returned to San Carlos, and then she was living with her father, Alcide, her mother, Kwakanata, her son, Kaileva, and then at this time she was 19 years old. In 1893, she was married to, Clarence Butler. So they were married at San Carlos in Gila County, which is near Globe, on January 1st, 1893. They were just married at the courthouse by the Justice of the Peace. In the 1900 census, we see her husband, Clarence Butler, and his race is listed as black. He was born in 1861, and he's 38 years old. They've been married for 8 years, and he was born in Pennsylvania, and he was a laborer. Of course, he speaks English. Says they own his own home, free and clear. We're not sure if he was actually living on a home or if he was living on the reservation. I imagine it was a house, but we're not really sure. Of course, we have Amelia. His race just says Indian. It doesn't list whether she's a Tonto or Apache. Place of birth just says Arizona. Reason rights, yes. So they have 5 children. Mary, age 7. Clarence Jr., age 5. Frank, 4. Daughter, Myrtle. And then Clarence, his brother also lived, John Butler, and he's working at the smelter down in Globe. So that makes me think they were actually living in the town of Globe if he was working in the smelter. But he could have been living indigenous too. I don't know. But I would think they were living in a home. So then in the 1910 census, they were at Camp Roosevelt. So as the Roosevelt Dam was being built, a lot of people were working up there, and there was a camp up there. So we have Clarence Butler there with his 2 sons, Clarence Jr. and Frank, and then their daughters, Myrtle and Laura, and they were lodgers in a work camp in the Tonto National Forest. And then somehow in 1918, Amelia ends up somewhere up here in the Verde Valley, and through this Camp Verde agency, this is just a census, it does by Camp Verde agency. It doesn't really say where they live in the Verde Valley. But now she's with a John Link, and it says that's her husband now. And you can see that all of the children are listed as stepchildren. And the oldest son has a son of his own that was born in 1917, who doesn't yet have a name. So I'm not sure what happened, but it gets a little interesting. So Amelia Butler died just a year later. She was only 47 years old. Said heart failure and liver complication. And she died in Mesa, Arizona. So she must have left here and gone to Mesa, Arizona, and it'll make more sense. But her parents now are listed as Samuel Shaw and Susie Shaw, where before you saw the given names. Well, I did find a census that said that her father had changed his name from Alcide to Samuel Shaw. So I clarified that this definitely was her parents. And an informant was her former husband, or maybe was still her husband, Clarence Butler. So I'm assuming maybe that she had got sick, maybe gone to Phoenix. Clarence Sr. was living with one of their daughters at the time, so maybe she went down there to get medical care, but she's buried in the Mesa Cemetery and not up here in the Native American Cemetery. So now we have a 1923 census. This is Clarence Butler Jr. He's now has his son and his brothers and sisters living with him. So he's taking care of them now that his mother's gone. And now they're in Clarkdale, 1930. So this is Clarence Butler, is renting a home in Clarkdale, working as a laborer. Lists that he is half Tonto, and he married Sarah Butler, who's a full Pima. So all their children are listed as 3/4 Tonto Pima. So this is just a family tree I tried to make in order to keep all the names and the people straight, but it helps diagram her life. And then this is her son, Clarence Butler Jr., and their family. And now we're on to Peter Okate. So Peter Okate, or Okatia, is in the upper left. He was a full Yavapai. We can know that also from the home address where it lists his chief is Pete. That was Marshal Pete, who was a chief of one of the clans or tribes of the Yavapai. On his right is Colton Balcazar. His student ID card said he arrived in January 1887, so he wasn't part of the original 1884 clan, but he ran away in August of 1887 and they never heard of him again. This happened quite a lot where they would run away, and they would even send government officials out to try to find them, and sometimes they did. Because can you imagine trying to get back to Arizona from Pennsylvania? No. So in the lower left there is, his name is Grasshopper, but he later changed his name to George Noria. And next to George is Justin Head. And I don't know if anybody's heard about the Justin Head story, but he's pretty famous here, and we'll get into that. So Peter Okatia was there for 7 years, and then he enlisted in the Army. Pratt really didn't want to return any of the men to Arizona, the reservation. He tried to convince many of them to join the military, and a lot of them did. So when Peter joined in 1891, they immediately sent him to Fort Washakie in Wyoming. This was in the Shoshone area where they were still having uprisings there. And he was there till 1893, and then he came back to San Carlos where he enlisted there, was at Fort Apache up in the White Mountains for a while, and then he was down at Fort Huachuca in 1893. This is when we had the Geronimo outbreak, and they were down there trying to gather up the Chiricahua Apaches. And then finally in 1894, he was discharged at San Carlos. So in 1899, this is the last census for him at San Carlos, because this is when they all started migrating to the Verde Valley. Shows him with his family, his wife, and a daughter with no name, who we assume is the daughter, Laura, that we'll hear about next. So Peter Okatia was very prominent in the Justin Head case. So on the left there is actually, it's a subpoena and an expense affidavit for Peter Okatia to go to Prescott to attend the trial. So Justin Head, we noticed he was a former classmate at Carlisle, and they knew each other. And Justin Head was charged with the murder of 5 other indigenous people on November 6, 1906. The first killing happened here in Cottonwood. Actually, it was really Clarkdale, just not far from here, past Vincent Randall's home up on the hill. And then he ran off and went down to Camp Verde, where Apache was chasing him, and he killed 4 more. And we'll get into that detail more. But it was interesting that we have the stage fare. He was paid stage fare from Cottonwood to Jerome, and then the railroad, I don't know if you know, it ran from Jerome over to Prescott at the time. They paid him $8.50 for that. 7 days room and board at $1 a day. They paid him for his interpreter services 1 day before the grand jury and 1 day before the district court of $10. So he got $25 for the whole episode. One of the other things he was involved in being an interpreter was very key in starting the first Indian school here in Camp Verde. So this is a newspaper article from the Bisbee Review where it says a request unique in the history of the executive office was made to Governor Kibbe. 3 Yavapai County Apache Mojave Indians, Yavapai, residents of the Verde Valley near Cottonwood, they made a trip to Phoenix to see Governor Kibbe, asking to start their own school in the Verde Valley. And an article states it has been generally supposed the older Indians, if not actually opposed to the white man's school, or at least not in favor of it. But this request has proved that at least one notable section to the general rule prevails. Since Justin Head, the Carlisle graduate, shot and killed 5 Indians in the Verde Valley, it was thought the Verde Indians would never countenance an education of their offspring. As they attributed Head's education, or at least it was alleged by some, the estrangement from his people for this crime. But the request of the 3 Indians, Chief Novak, Second Chief John Cava, and Peter Okatia, disproves this belief. So this was 1906, so Justin did the murders in November 1906. This was just a month later that they went and petitioned the governor. And then in 1907, the request was granted, and they did set up the first school down in Camp Verde, and it was actually in what's the museum now on the Fort Verde grounds. That's where the first school was held. So Taylor Gabbard established the first school in 1907. He served as the superintendent of the camp agency as well, the Indian agency. He was a staunch advocate for the establishment of indigenous lands. They really wanted to get their land back like they have now, a lot more of it that was taken away. I'm not sure if he was involved in that. They didn't get land until I think later, probably in the 30s through the 60s. And then he's shown here with his students. So this is him and his wife. I may not be able to, this is him and his wife up here, and then their students. And that picture was in 1909. So now we have a 1910 census that's stated Township 13 North, Range 5 East, which when you look it up on a map, looks like it's a Wingfield area south of Camp Verde. But what I learned after looking at many of the censuses with the other Yavapai Apache people, that it just is not true. So if you see it, they've put a line through that. And I really believe that this census was up in the Cottonwood, or what was Clarkdale, Cottonwood area. So Peter Okatia was working as a farm laborer. He's listed as a full-blooded Mojave Apache, which means he is a Yavapai, attended Carlisle, and is living in an aboriginal dwelling, meaning he's living in a wickiup. He's 41, his wife is 25. She's the mother of 7 children, but only 1 is still alive. So she must have had issues bearing children. Does she speak English? No, just Yavapai, but she's a basket maker as well. Laura Okate, their daughter, age 12, she does speak English, so Peter must have taught her to speak English, I'm assuming, because there was no school at the time. Well, there was, 1907. I'm not sure if she attended the school. It says schooling none, so she did not. I'm sorry. So in 1914, Peter Okatia's daughter, Laura, is married to a John McGee, married 17th of September 1914, right here in Clarkdale. She was married by Reverend Thomas and Madison Blacklock. And so the witnesses, which are interesting, is George Willard Might. I don't think he's related to Millward. It might be a Native American took that name, because I don't know any Mites. But then Albert Henry Kohler, who I know is a Native American, he's a Yavapai. But what's interesting is neither one of her parents were here as witnesses. So I'm not sure if their marriage was condoned or not, but she was 16 at the time, which is probably not uncommon for that time, but I thought that was kind of interesting. So then 1916-17, the Camp Verde Agency, they did a census every year. And now we see Maddie Okate with her children, but we don't see Peter Okate anymore. So I'm assuming that during that time frame he passed away, there's no death certificate at all. Then in 1918, 1919, we have a census for John McGee, and he is now a widower living in Clarkdale. So she had passed away, Laura. The 1919 census for Camp Verde. So John McGee is a widower, and then it is believed she died in 1918 or 1919. Now this is her daughter, Effie Okatia. Oh, this is Peter's daughter, Effie Okatia. She died of natural causes on August 13, 1929 in Prescott. She was only 15, which is really young. She's listed as living in an indigenous camp about 1 mile north of Prescott. Place of burials, cremation, or removal is listed as Clarkdale. So they brought her remains to Clarkdale, and so I'm assuming she's buried here. I'm not sure what they did with her remains, but probably over in the Yavapai Apache Cemetery. 1930 census, Maddie and her son Ralph are living in Clarkdale, but they're living with her sister, Edith Quayle, at an indigenous village, which is probably up here at the end of the main street. So there's a connection to the Quayle family. She's 50 now. And then unfortunately, Maddie died as well pretty early in 1931. So according to the record, she died of heart disease. She was only 52 years old. And as tragically, her son died very young as well. He was only 25, and it says pulmonary tuberculosis. So you got to wonder if maybe the whole family might have had some sort of form of tuberculosis. Maybe they had it, and some just had it worse than others. I'm not sure, but all of them seem to die at a very young age. But there could be many reasons for their death. So this is a family tree of Peter Okate and his wife Maddie. And Justin Head. Of course, we talked about Justin Head. He was one that committed the 5 murders. So this whole story of the San Carlos 52 started when I had a conversation. I had the privilege of meeting Vincent Randall while I was volunteering at the museum one day. And he told this story of Justin Head. He goes, there were these murders right over here by this educated Indian named Justin Rathead. And that's what his Indian name. He goes, my mother told me this story. His mother lived her whole life right over here. And he goes, and he got a bunch of information from the gentleman at the Verde Independent, a lot of the same records I got from Carlisle, and they had found a census up to 1920 where Justin was last at in 1920. Well, I'd been doing genealogical research for the last 30 years of my own family. I thought, well, I can probably find another census or where he's buried. And that's what got me started on this trail, but I had no idea that the trail was going to lead to the Justin Head story and into this story, but it's very fascinating. So Justin Head was there for 9 years. He's half Tonto and half Mojave, so he's both Apache and Yavapai. We also know this from his chief is listed. It's Pacula, Pacula, Pacuala. From the records that I've read and the books I've read, that chief was not ever designated as a true Yavapai or Apache, so that still makes me think that he was part of that clan that was half Yavapai and half Apache. And then he worked at several farms in the outing system while he was there. But he came back with a 6th grade education. They listed they came back because of some sort of illness, but that was pretty educated back then since most of them really had like a 2nd or 3rd grade education when they came back. So he got back in 1892. He was living with his uncle and aunt, and then I'm assuming it may have been a sister. Juaju is just listed as a niece, not really sure. In 1893, he's now married. He has a wife, Minaya. She's 25 years old, or 28 years old. And we see that it's at the end of this census, it says 81 Mojaves, which also means Yavapai. So even though he's half Apache and half Yavapai, and since they listed Tonto, Apache first, typically that means that his mother was Apache and his father was Yavapai. That's kind of how they did it. But somehow either this is just part of that mixed group, or he may have kind of trended more towards the Yavapai. Not really sure. So when he returned to the Verde Valley, he had two places. He was living in Camp Verde near West Clear Creek. He had a camp there, and he also lived up here around Clarkdale Cottonwood because he did a lot of interpreter work in Jerome for a lawyer in Jerome. So being that he was half Apache and half Yavapai, a lot of them spoke both Yavapai and Apache. Maybe not very well, but enough, just because of how they were raised. So the story went that in providing interpreter service on legal cases, he had drawn the ire of many indigenous people. And there's an article in 1906 that says, it seemed he incurred the ill will of these people by telling straight stories in court, they having made threats against him. And so there's a lot of witnesses and other stories that corroborated this around Jerome. But in 1906, November 6th, it was reported that he killed 5 other indigenous people, 1 near Cottonwood and 4 others near Camp Verde. So what happened was, there was some sort of argument. He was at a camp. He had been drinking some what they called tiswine, which was a beer made out of corn. It wasn't very strong. But the other story was, it wasn't just tiswine, it was whiskey. So not really sure, but whatever it was, for what it was, when he left there was an argument, and he was being threatened all the time, and at this time he felt that whoever it was going to kill him this time. And so he went and got his gun from his camp here in Clarkdale Cottonwood, and he saw somebody coming by, and he just shot and killed him in self-defense. And then he took off for Camp Verde, his brother, who's George Beauty, which we know the Beauties were also in Clarkdale. And he's half Yavapai and half Apache, hoping to get some help. And of course, a lot of the chiefs were living down in that area as well. But anyway, after 3 days on the run, he turned himself into the sheriff in Jerome. There were lots of newspaper articles about the killings. It was pretty sensationalized. Armed men are hunting down Apache. Apache Indian kills 5 others. It was pretty crazy. Let me get to one of the stories real quick. So one says, a brave, emulating late Apache kid starts out on a red path of murder. This murder was an incident of a drunken brawl. He was pursued by about 100 Indians into whom he had fired at, killing 3 men and a squaw. He was armed with a repeating Winchester and supplied with over 100 rounds of ammunition. And with the determination to not be taken alive, he was going to kill as many people as he could. That was the story. I'm not sure I believe that story, but that's the way it was written. And then Herb Young had wrote a book called They Came to Jerome, and he mentions this story in here as well. And he says, Head went into hiding, but the story was circulated around for those 3 days that he was out, that he was going on a rampage, planning to kill as many men as he could. So this got all the other Native Americans riled up, and many of them went up to Jerome to get protection from the sheriff up in Jerome. And then one of the other articles which was interesting was, there was a grand jury in another case where a lot of murders and assaults were blamed on liquor. So what happened was, when they came back to the Verde Valley, there was no control of the Native Americans drinking alcohol. They were making it, they were buying whiskey. Where when they were at San Carlos, that was all controlled. You know, they were only allowed to make so much tiswine for certain ceremonies, and they weren't allowed to buy any alcohol. This is a picture of the mass burial in 1906 from Charlotte Hall. So if you notice, there's 4 caskets here, and there was 5 killings. So this goes along with the story that there was 1 killing here in Cottonwood, Clarkdale, and then the other 4 were down near Camp Verde. The X over this gentleman's head, that's George Hance. He was the justice of this peace at Camp Verde. First it looks like there's a cross back, maybe he's holding a cross, but it's just somebody marked an X on the photo when you scanned it, that's what that is. But there's some Native Americans that buried him, and then whoever it was carried the coffins there. I've been to a site down there where I believe that the burial's at, and I've reached out to the Yavapai Apache Nation, there are archaeologists there, and told them that they may be buried there, but there's no markers, and we're not really sure. Vincent Randall believed that they were all buried up here right off Broadway because there's an unmarked cemetery up there. And the photo you had is not very good. I mean, if you look at it, you could think that it looks like Clarkdale if you're looking back this way, if you're up on the hill off of Broadway, which it does. But I have a much cleaner photo, and in the background, you can tell that that's almost looking to the salt mine area of Camp Verde. So, and then there's other articles in the Justin Head story that talk about that. So this is an article after Justin Head was captured and was in prison, where he had given an interview, and this is just his account. He said, Old Man Wilson, this is the guy who had threatened him many times, and he testified in a trial for his son, where his son got 1 year in the Yuma prison. So there was already angst between these two. He says, threatened my life before, but he looked like he wanted to kill me this time. That was on the night. So I rode back to my camp, and securing my Winchester, shot and killed him as he was passing behind my camp. I then mounted my horse and rode in the direction of my brother's camp. That's George Beauty near Camp Verde. Before I go to see my brother, I met 3 Indians drinking tiswine in another camp, and as I was passing, one of them tried to stop me, another tried to get a hold of me, and the third got a gun and ran around the tent to head me off if I escaped the others. I shot the Indian with the gun as he came around the corner and shot another of the 2 trying to hold me, and mounted my horse and rode in the direction of where my brother was camped. When I got there, a number of Indians were waiting to capture me. Some Indians from Cottonwood have gotten there ahead of me and told me that I had shot Old Man Wilson. So Vincent Randall had told this story, and there's a video on the our Clarkdale Historical Museum website. If you get a chance to listen to it, read it. But he said what happened was the Native Americans at the time, what they called moccasin telegraph, where the moccasins were faster than everything else. That was their communication device. So they were pretty good about spreading the word really fast of what happened. So that's why they caught up with him by the time we got to Camp Verde. He goes, I returned along the east bank of the river in the direction of my camp at Cottonwood with the intention of getting to Jerome before the Indians could kill me. I traveled near the road sometimes, but saw nobody. I have a bad stone bruise on my left heel and was compelled to take my boots off to walk anyway, so I have traveled the whole distance by barefoot. I thought that was interesting. I did find it interesting that there was a lot of former Yavapai Apache scouts in this posse and never could find Justin Head. I thought that was kind of interesting. Either he was very good at hiding, or by this time they weren't as good at scouting. I have no idea. I thought that was kind of interesting. So this article is from the Weekly Journal Minor, November 14, 1906. So eventually they had a trial. The grand jury was convened on December 6, 1906 at the courthouse in Prescott. He was charged with 5 counts of murder in the 2nd degree. The trial was held, and he was convicted on just 1 count of 2nd-degree murder for Mrs. George Russell and sentenced to life in prison. The other 4 charges were all dismissed. Justin always maintained that he shot and killed only the 3 people and did not shoot his brother or Mrs. George Russell. So his brother got shot in the arm and shattered his elbow. And in Herb Young's book, he reported that George Beauty had died, but he didn't. They rushed him off to Prescott, and they were able to do surgery or whatever they needed to help him out. So he's still alive. This is a prison record of Justin Head. He was sent to the Yuma prison. There's quite a lot of information there. He's 32 years old, 5'9", 142 pounds. It says he's a vegetable gardener. It does say name or address of nearest relation. This is George Beauty at Camp Verde, Arizona. Down at the bottom you see he was transferred to Florence in 1909. So what happened was the Yuma prison shut down. It was kind of known as the Alcatraz of Arizona. It was not a very nice prison, but they'd shut that down, and that's when they opened up the Florence. So he was just transferred there because they'd shut the prison down. His sentence was commuted by Governor Sloan, and he was paroled on February 10th, 1910, which is interesting. So this is a return record that he got while he was in jail. And so when he received this record, he completed the survey, and he was telling about how he got into prison, how he got convicted of these murders. And so this led to numerous communications between Justin, the school superintendent, Moses M. Friedman, and a lawyer in Jerome named Charles H. Rutherford. So he was communicating a lot, writing, trying to get himself paroled, which he did end up doing. But the condition of his parole was he had to leave the state of Arizona and never come back. So what was weird was, if you notice, this is 1911, and he got paroled in 1910. I think what happened was the parole got done, but they were trying to figure out a way to get him back to Carlisle and set that up, because that was the only way he could go back there. Where else were they going to put him if he left Arizona? So he writes this long letter right after he submits the survey to Moses M. Friedman, who's now the superintendent instead of Henry Pratt. And he says, "Dear friend, I'm glad to hear from you and ask me the questions you want to answer. I wanted to tell you about my trouble with an Indian about 5 years ago." And so he's talking about Henry Wilson and the trial. "I'm always trying to do right for the Mojave Apaches. I help all I can for them, but they're turned sideways on me and said that I'm just made up talk for myself. Said that to me all the time whenever I interpret for them when they get into trouble. They always get after me and they try to put me in trouble the way trouble comes. Those Apache Mojave Indians, they get after me and try to kill me. But I done at it in self-defense and saved my life. All the Indians got after to kill me, so I run to the town of Jerome, Arizona, and gave myself up to the United States Marshal. And he taken me to the town of Prescott and have tried me there and got my sentence in life term in prison. And some of the white people there who knows me, that I was a good man among them, they all believing that I am self-defense during this." Granted, this is Justin's version of the story, right? So we have to take it for what it is, but it's very interesting to see this handwritten letter by him. It's very compelling. So from 1912 to 1915, he went back to Carlisle, but he was mainly working in the outing system. He was too old to be a student, and so they were just using him for labor. They would send him on a farm out in Bucks County, sending his wages back to Carlisle, and he would get very little. And he stayed there, but during this whole time, he was writing Charles Rutherford, he was writing the U.S. government, the Department of Interior, the parole board. He had to have a report once a month from the Carlisle superintendent of his conduct. And so he worked religiously, and there's probably over 20 letters that he'd written and other documents of this whole time. And by some way, he was finally pardoned in 1915 by the governor of Arizona, George W.P. Hunt. It's amazing because you would think that if some Native American had killed 5 people and sent life in prison, that they would never get out. So I'm not sure what the details were, but it is quite unique. So the last census we have, like I said, was 1920 in New Jersey. Justin is now married to Daisy Voorhees, a black woman, and living with her parents in Trenton, New Jersey. So he'd gone away from Carlisle once he realized what was happening, and he just left it. Real quick, so I have another presentation that's on Justin Head, and it's way longer than this, and it's the whole story of the trial. I have documents. I know who the people that were killed were, the names of them. I believe I've identified Mrs. George Russell in that, which has always been people were curious about, all of the documentation. And I was working on this for Mr. Randall in August of last year, and by the time I got all the documentations was when he had passed away. So my hope was that I would give him that information and he could tell the story, because he's such a great orator and probably could tell the story better than I can. But now I guess I'm going to have to be the bearer of that information. So hopefully in January, we'll have the full story of Justin Head and we can reveal all that information. Questions? Yes.
Questions? Oh, thank you very much. This is an amazing array of important genealogical research. and I'm very impressed and pleased that you've made the presentation.
Thank you.
But I wanted to go back to Geronimo for just a moment that you mentioned. And for many, it may be a trivial or unimportant linguistic point, but in your opinion, was Geronimo captured or did he surrender?
Well, I think he somewhat surrendered, because if you've read any of the history, they went out and met with him, and I think he realized at the time that his family was getting killed off, all the people, his women and children were getting killed off, and it was just the end of the line. I mean, he fought the good fight as best he could, right? And to be honest, he got captured in New Mexico when he broke away from San Carlos. They actually really captured and brought him back. But the conditions were so bad, there were a lot of breakouts by a lot of the warriors just because they weren't getting the food. And they would break away just to go hunting and gather food for themselves. They were starving to death. So there was a lot of that. Then, of course, they had Yavapai, different tribes of Yavapai and Apache, all in one concentrated area, and a lot of them did not get along. So there were a lot of issues, but be honest, yeah, he gave up, but he knew the fight was, to me, he knew the fight was over. I mean, he didn't have the support of a lot of the warriors. A lot of the chiefs that broke away the very last time, they came back, they just gave up, you know. And it was, they were killing the women and children. They just, yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
A couple questions, actually. Why did they do a census for every year at Carlisle? Or I'm just, to me, a census is every 10 years. But this looks like every year there was a census
Right.
for just Native Americans?
Right, so what they were called was the M595 rolls, or the Indian rolls. And they did this because they, on the reservation, had to keep track of how many people were there, because the government was supplying funds for the food and the care, whether clothing or everything else, based on the number of people living on these reservations. So that was just a government way of keeping track of what was on the reservation.
So this was all over the United States?
Yes.
On all
Yeah, it's called the
agencies, reservations, whatever?
It's called the M595 roll. So all of this is available on Ancestry.com. This is where I've got all of this information. There's tons of information out there. You can search and find them. You can search by the agency. But if you notice, when they came from San Carlos up to Camp Verde, there really wasn't an agency for about 6 or 7 years till they started the school. So the people from San Carlos were trying to come up and get counts of the people up here, but you know, it was hard to find them all until they set up the agency when the school was there. So if you notice, I don't know if you noticed, some of the census said Camp Verde Indian School or Phoenix Indian School is part of the census.
Do you know if, you were talking about the Camp Verde Indian School, was that related to the Clarkdale Indian School? 'Cause
No.
there's one photograph that floats around among museums.
List of documents that are available online, and so that's where I've gotten all these.